You're listening to AI IRL, a podcast dedicated to democratizing artificial intelligence for today's fastest growing companies. If you're looking to learn from actual implementers and industry experts who have built and used the latest AI software to enhance every potential customer's experience, this is the podcast for you. Let's get into the show.
Hello, welcome. This is Ryan Lester, your host of AI IRL. A topic that we've touched on a couple times on the podcast, but I feel like we don't probably give it as much energy or reinforcement as we should, is the thought about taking really a user-centric approach to thinking about to technology like AI. Too often we get caught up in the technology from a technology sake or implementation perspective or a business problem perspective. But in reality, much of this is around the user experience, and are you delivering a better user experience through a tech like AI? And so I'm excited for my guest this week, who really, this is his life. He really takes a user-centric design thinking approach and is bringing that to the world of AI through better customer experiences. So joining this week is Chris Butler, who is IPsoft's Chief Product Architect. Chris has over 19 years of product and business development experience at companies like Microsoft, Kayak, and Waze. He first got introduced to AI through graph theory and genetic algorithms during his computer systems engineering degree at Boston University. Shout out to Boston. And before IPsoft, he was director of AI, where he created techniques around empathy mapping for machine and computer mapping to create cross-team alignment while building AI products. So, Chris, welcome. I think your background is really impressive, and really excited to have you on the podcast this week.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, and so I think too often there's a lot of noise around AI. The sizzle to the steak, I think, is oftentimes out of balance. But the one thing I think that too often gets missed is really around that, kind of user empathy and design thinking, and really what is the impact to the end user of a new technology like AI and all the downstream implementation challenges, UI challenges, et cetera. So let's start there with kind of from your perspective and the work you're doing. How should companies be thinking about this, and what kind of a role should design thinking be playing in a world of AI?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key components that you're really getting at here is how do we build these systems to be in service of people rather than the other way around, right? And especially we talk about how you even start to consider ethical practice or consideration within that. How are you making sure that the outcome or the system that you're building really takes everybody into account? And I think maybe the number one thing is that, as we start to build out the teams that are building these products, right? Too often we limit the number of people that are in a room to help add to that conversation. And so that means that, yes, definitely we need to have data scientists, machine learning engineers, even the people that are doing the theory behind these things, maybe if you include R&D. But you also need to be including designers, product people, management, and even your customer or the people that are in some way impacted by your customer's actions. And so I think too often we're not including them in the room. And that's maybe the number one thing, especially when we talk about the nuance of how these systems change the conversation between people and the systems that are built, right? We're no longer talking about one human being in front of one computer that is just typing away by themselves, right? We're actually usually talking about an ecosystem or an environment within an organization or within even the world at large where people are being intermediated in some way by machines. And those machines really are meant to do something that is for the purpose of all these human beings. I would argue, and I tend to really go after this a lot in my design thinking discussions, but there's no such thing as a human out of the loop, right? And that's a term that we'll hear an awful lot, I think, in the military context. But there's no such thing as someone being out of the loop. Most of the time, even when we talk about machine learning off doing something on its own, there's still some human impact somewhere. I would even go as far as saying that, when we talk about weapon systems being fully autonomous, and there's a lot of discussion in the AI world about that today, is that there's still someone being shot at, right? You're just not drawing the system boundary correctly in those cases. So pulling the people back into that discussion, I think is the first thing and definitely most important.
Yeah, and I think one point I'd reinforce there is also that when you have a subset of the key stakeholders in the room, they'll often be biased towards the decision that services them best.
Absolutely.
So if you have technologists all in the room, they're going to make the best technology decision for them. But to your point, that may have negative downstream consequences to the person you actually all care about, the end user. or the user, or the people related to that user. So I think that you're spot on that. One thing that I reinforce this a lot on this podcast, is just making sure you have a good cross section in the room when you're making these decisions, and you're properly drawing your system model. Now that can get really complicated, so you may have to break into a couple of pieces, but that you're really drawing that system dynamics model in as holistic way as you can, because to your point, there are negative consequences that often can become very big that may be unseen in the beginning.
That's right. And I think, from the product practitioner standpoint, right, a product person, product manager, there's a lot of things that we discuss when it comes to what is the outcome we're really trying to get at, right? What is the business impact? What is the customer outcome? And what a lot of the time when we talk about machine learning algorithms themselves, usually we have a very simplistic way of considering or thinking about the way that we're doing, learning within that context. And so more than anything, how you start to consider the fact that you're not always going to be just optimizing one metric within these systems anymore. And so how do you now not just satisfying, but maybe satisficing multiple different objectives at the same time, some of which you need to trade off between and or make hard decisions between sometimes. And so that's maybe when we discuss the idea of what are the business impacts, right? That's generally what executives or management will care about. The technical implications around feasibility is really what the engineers or the data scientists will care about potentially. And then finally, product people are really like, why are we doing this, right? And so, there's some interesting things around that too. And how do we actually do a better job of even setting out the objectives of these systems? That's definitely something that I think is within the realm of the product manager's role when building out AI, machine learning, and data science types of projects.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point at the end there of how do they also, it's not always on them to make everything approachable, but how are they teeing up the conversation in a way that lets more people get involved in the decision-making process. So it's not, once again, down in the weeds of the technology or the technologist, which is important. You want to make sure you do that the right way. But at the same time, you're making it so that the person that is your understanding customer behavior can understand what are the trade-offs they're balancing, when it often is seen through more of a technical lens.
That's right. And things that are really important are not always easily measurable. But there is some way that you can either find leading or following indicators that can help you do a better job of including that in the decision-making process, right? I think Google Pair, which is their kind of human-centered machine learning group, has a really amazing guide, which I think really echoes a lot of these types of things. How do you deal with errors correctly? How do you make sure that the person understands enough about the system so that they can make the right type of decision, right? Because what you're really doing when you're building these systems is that it may be making a decision automatically, but then in some way that human being needs to be either affected or impacted by that, which will then cause them to also make decisions. So there's never a time, and I think a lot of the tools that we see from things like design thinking, human-centered design, service design, all those tools really try to put in context, how does this one tool fit within the larger experience for people? So one thing we worked on when I was at Philosophy, which is the design consultancy where I was director of AI and product strategy, we were doing a lot of work around field service operations, which field service operations is essentially where you can't take whatever thing that you bought and ship it back to the manufacturer to be fixed. Like it's, the AC or HVAC system within a building, you can't like rip it out and return it. So you have to have someone come on site to actually help fix it or troubleshoot what could be going wrong. And so in this world of field service operations, you have many different people that are working on this. You have field techs, you have dispatchers, you have management, you have warehouse, you have parts runners, et cetera, et cetera. And so while we're there, we were working on a project for PwC and Google, trying to think about how do we do a better job of providing, say, prediction services, different types of work tools, organizational tools that make those people's lives easier. And so balancing a lot of the things that the field tech would be going through, right? So what is the employee satisfaction there? How well is the customer actually feeling about the service that's happening? Is very much impacted by how well the dispatcher does their job as far as organizing all the work. And so there were a lot of things that we looked at that were not only, is this job ready to go out, which was a really interesting study in kind of explainability of algorithms, right? So if we were to give a confidence score that based on all the information we have, was this job going to require a return trip or not? That was something that would drive cost within the organization. And so not only did we want to reduce cost, but we wanted to increase customer satisfaction, we wanted to increase employee satisfaction, and we wanted to just in general kind of make this more smoothly operating. And so we provided a lot of tools, and some of those tools were to, like I was saying, how do you know whether this job is going to be, if it was assigned today, that this job was going to actually work out in some positive way? And so if we just provided, say, a confidence score from the algorithm or from the machine learning algorithm that we were going to build, people didn't really understand what that meant. And so the explainability or understanding, the interpretability of that particular algorithm was incredibly important. And so we didn't really discover that unless we had done these prototypes. And we didn't even build an algorithm or machine learning algorithm at that point to pretend, we were basically just pretending what type of information we'd be getting out of these algorithms. And what was most important is that person building trust with the interface? Do they understand what's going on? Are they able to intervene in some way when it's appropriate? And so all those things are aspects that you can test before you actually collect all the data and actually make sure that you're building out the algorithm correctly.
Yeah, it's almost like you're taking that kind of lean approach or that simple approach of how do we build some test rigs or some test scenarios where we can start to instrument things and not fully instrument them, but instrument to a point where we're like, okay, are the feedback loops here and the things that we could collect to then make more informed decisions or to then build a bigger, more complex model there. And let's validate that first before we go and do a much bigger implementation. And I think that's another important aspect of this is like, how do you do the test version to start to say, okay, we think we're going to instrument it in this way. We think this data is interesting. Let's do it to then see what are the signals we're seeing and then what levers can we pull. And I think that's also an important aspect of this, of not trying to do all of it at once, not trying to, build the entire factory in the first pass, but rather let's take a more step function approach and learn along the way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's a place for these technologies too, right? We still have to kind of consider how things like regular websites, applications, and then even just basic customer support through human beings really fits within that. And that's a lot of what I focus on at IPsoft is our conversational agent named Amelia. And so where you actually deploy conversational agents is something that I think is still fairly nuanced and we're learning as time goes on, as the technology, as the NLP, NLU tools are starting to catch up, where we can build something that can, through the seemingly random almost utterances that human beings are saying to these systems, being able to actually understand an intent, pull out the appropriate entities to then take some process or action is something that we're getting better at. Now, I do think, though, that when we consider, like today, there's not a lot of conversational agents that are actually deployed. And I would say that's partially because of the hyped up chatbots of about 3 or 4 years ago were pretty disappointing for people, right? Like they didn't actually carry a conversation. They didn't do things like contextual switching between topics. They didn't really follow a regular conversation with a human being. And so, the way the world has worked for a very long time is that you had, say you're trying to look at the complexity of a task, right? The very simple tasks or the tasks that were not that complicated generally were within web services, apps, things like that, but they were very high volume. And so you were getting benefits as a creator of these systems by having a web app or an application provide that type of functionality. But then everything else would be escalated to a human being. And the problem is also people kind of believe that they could build a bunch of stuff into their web app and still have people understand how to use it. But the truth is that's why like so many people are escalating to customer support for seemingly very simple things. Now, conversational agents fit in between these places, right? So it's not necessarily that you want to remove the application that the person would use on their phone for regular stuff. Like if you can build a habit around it, you probably should still use your mobile app or a website. And so the example I like to give is that for, say, banking websites, right, or banks in general, the things that people can build habits around on their mobile phone or on their desktop are things like getting their account balances, and even the fact that they can do something like a bill pay, right? Those are things that they do on a regular basis. They learn how to do them. They build habits in those apps to do those things. And then on the other extreme, though, is that there are things that are maybe highly specialized when it comes to maybe financial consulting, advising, that are actually very hard for an app to do correctly to be able to provide me with that information. And so that's still where a human being or a good conversation with a human could really work. But in between those things are aspects like figuring out how to do a repeating ACH transfer, right? Like that's something that I probably can do through a mobile app for my bank. The problem is that I only have to do it maybe once or twice a year, maybe. And it's so infrequent that they're probably changing the app more rapidly than I'm actually learning how to do it in their app. And so in those cases, being able to just ask something to be able to find out how to do it, and not even just find out how to do it, but have it taken care of for me is really, really important. And so that's where, starting to see where these types of models fit in. The same thing with say, highly targeted dashboard systems that use prediction technology to give me, say in like the case of a doctor getting an understanding of a prognosis. There's a lot of really interesting work going in there where it's not just about the idea of how do I present this information to someone, but how do I work with the biases or the cognitive kind of simplifications that human beings do on a regular basis to provide a better dashboard that tries to help me be a better decision maker. And so all those things are really important, I think, when we start to consider how these more advanced technologies, these advanced algorithmic technologies that are frankly non-deterministic, right? Like they're not going to fail in ways that are just considered bugs anymore. They're going to fail in ways that are really, really hard for us to kind of pin down why, because sometimes they will not be explainable to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that I like that you touched on there is the fact that it's also multifaceted in that there's multiple users involved with the system that could be interacting with these things. So it's not just a end user. So I like your doctor-patient example of you could have a bot that works with a patient. There's a good, I had a previous guest that has a bot called Wobot, which is about cognitive therapy. So, it's a bot that reinforces daily really good cognitive therapy approaches. And that's patient facing or end user facing. But then you could also have something that works with the doctor behind the scenes to, once again, to your point, do better patient planning, help the doctor think through approaches, helps to gain them access to information that maybe they didn't know was available or was hard to find. But then you could also have the insurance carrier or the front office person, someone that's maybe it's even around back office support. So, processing payments. So there is also interesting thing about even in a vertical or even within like a small group of people working together, there are even a variety of different ways you can take this technology and make it quite applicable. So whether it's the actual end customer, in this case, the patient, or it's the service provider, the doctor, or it's the back-end systems, there's all sorts of places where you can be implementing this technology to create a better outcome.
No, that's exactly right. And all of those people in that example need different types of explanations about why the algorithm is making a decision. And in fact, it's actually not going to be one algorithm, right? Like it's going to be a handful of different algorithms that are all doing different things. And so, there's been some really great work around, especially like explainable AI or XAI. There's a really great paper at Chi this year that was talking about how do you understand, the fact that people do fall prey to biases like anchoring bias or recency bias or confirmation bias, right? And so how do you design a dashboard that allows me to make a better decision? And that could be as a patient, right? That could be as a doctor, and that could be as the insurance carrier. And all of those people are trying to optimize their set of circumstances in some way. And so I think, when we think about the longer term approach of these things too, is I think models, especially machine learning models, are really interesting for us to help identify our own biases, right? Because they do the best job of actually generalizing the set of rules. And so the example, I think that's used a lot right now is Amazon's example of where they created basically an algorithm to try to judge whether a resume was someone that would be hired or not, right? Yeah. And that's a great example of where they did the right thing in the sense that they found that their hiring practices, in this case, the bot learned a bunch of biases against women, basically.
Yes.
And what's so interesting about that is that this is a great way for us to understand that, that it's not just this algorithm that was biased, but it was the hiring practices in general that were biased in some way.
Yes.
And so I think, even getting beyond this, I think a lot about this idea of how are you adversarial to yourself and your biases to do a better job of kind of breaking out of this problematic mindsets that we have or assumptions. And so I think there's a longer term thing where, am I falling into patterns that I don't realize? And how does an algorithm help me identify those things more easily? Because really, anytime we're talking about a bias, it's really just about an identifiable pattern that we're not able to see. And so I think there's some really interesting things long term in how do we utilize or harness machine learning algorithms to really tell us where our biases are. It's still up to us to decide what we do with them, right? And that's maybe getting back to the key point here is that human beings are really the ones that are basically deciding what are the worthwhile problems to solve. right? And then it's machines that are helping give us tools to do that. Well, they're not actually helping give us tools, but human beings are building tools that then help us make better decisions in some way. And so that's really the most important thing, is how are we doing a better job of making decisions as time goes on?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. A good summary to our time together. And I know it's gone by quite quickly, but I really enjoyed the conversation. And I think once again, there's a lot to think about here around, how do we, first of all, take this design thinking approach? How do we segment the problem in a way to get more people involved in the discussion? And then finally, I think your point is a really good one of how do we also use these bias identification to just help us be more strategic or smarter in the way we approach these problems. So Absolutely. I think those are all, 3 great things for folks out there, is whether or not they're going down this journey of why AI and why do I need it, or even just how should I better approach problem solving within my company today. So I really appreciate the time.
Absolutely. No, it's been great to talk to you. And yeah, that's maybe the main thing, right? Is how do we include more people in these discussions, and how do we just make sure that we don't go overboard in trusting the machine to do something when it's reality, it's us. We're the person behind that curtain, right? That's who we are.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, thank you so much for the time, and looking forward to future conversations.
Great. Thank you so much.
Many companies are struggling to balance the demands of growth, the restrictions of legacy systems, and the competitive need to deliver amazing customer experiences across more channels. It's a mountain humans can't climb alone. Bold 360 combines AI and agent interaction solutions in one, so you can efficiently provide more satisfying experiences to more customers. To learn more, visit bold360.com.
You've been listening to AI IRL. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.